This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On July the 22nd, we hosted our second virtual military history night of the summer. Our speaker was Ottawa historian Ryan Stackhouse, who presented an in-depth exploration of Hitler's secret police, the Gestapo, and their response to criticisms of the Nazi regime. Enemies of the people, Hitler's critics, and the Gestapo.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second virtual presentation of RCMI's Military History Night, July the 22nd, 2020. My name is Patricia Hind-White, organizer of this event, which will be recorded for educational purposes. There will be a question and answer period following Ryan's talk, and request that you hold your questions until that time. I also ask at this time that you mute your mics. Bottom left of screen, click to mute and click again to unmute. The same with the, I ask you to do that, the question and answer. You can unmute for the question and answer. Once again, I would like to acknowledge RCMI's behind-the-scenes team, without whom this presentation would not happen. RCMI President Mike Hall, General Manager Garrett Wright, host of this evening, Sylvia Lau, Zoom Coordinator, Catherine Ely, Event Sales Manager, Eric Morse, Editor, Members News and Director of Publications, Jim Lutz, Events Committee Chair. And also at this time, I would like to make a special thanks to RCMI member Don Gracie for suggesting Ryan as a Military History Night speaker. Thank you very much. Tonight's guest speaker, Dr. J. Ryan Stackhouse, topic, Enemies of the People, Hitler's Critics and the Gestapo. Ryan is an historian of modern Europe, specializing in Nazism and everyday life under dictatorship. He has studied the origins and consequences of the Second World War since his teens. And at that time, he interviewed members of the Nova Scotia Highlanders and members of the 1st Special Services Branch from his hometown of Truro, Nova Scotia. Article went to Acadia and Albert Ludwig University Freiburg, where he developed an abiding fascination with Germany, which led him deeper into the study of state and society relations under dictatorship. Over the course of a decade of research, Ryan's MA with Alan McDougall at Guelph, examining the policing of radio criminals, gradually expanded. As a Walbalt Fellow with Robert Galately at FSU, his doctorate considered the policing of criticism and development of selective enforcement policies more broadly. His forthcoming book, Enemies of the People, described by peer reviewers at Cambridge University Press as the most important book on Gestapo policing in any language to date, examines the enforcement of laws governing criticism in Nazi Germany. And now, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, a warm welcome, Ryan, and I now turn the meeting over to you.
Well, thank you for the kind welcome, Pat, and good evening to everybody. First off, thank you to everyone working behind the scenes at RCMI who's made this presentation possible. And of course, everybody out there who's taken time from their busy schedules to join us here this evening. So without further ado, I'm going to be talking about the Nazi secret state police, better known as the Gestapo. And the Gestapo were the political police in Nazi Germany, which is to say they had jurisdiction over any politically motivated crime. Now, the definition of what constitutes a politically motivated crime, as well as the powers within that jurisdiction, were broad in the Third Reich to say the least. So the Gestapo could indefinitely hold suspects in a concentration camp. They could spy on people. They could torture them. After the declaration of war, they could even execute someone without involving the court system under a so-called special treatment execution. Because of this, we often find the Gestapo at the center of the regime's crimes against humanity. So in Eastern Europe, they managed the death camps where the Jews of Europe were murdered in the Holocaust. They were responsible for mass executions of civilians when there were reprisal operations for partisan attacks. And of course, they also managed in large part the labor deployment program when these same civilians were basically enslaved and sent to Germany as forced labor when so-called security dead zones were created behind the front. Now, as a result of this, we tend to think of terror as a likely explanation for why Germans went along with Nazism. If we know that the Gestapo executed and tortured these groups, how could anyone else have thought of going against the regime? So the problem with this totalitarian terror thesis is that it conflicts with what we know about Hitler's broad popularity. Tearing up the Versailles Treaty, like marching into the Rhineland, remilitarization, annexation of the Sudetenland, Anschluss with Austria, each of these were incredibly popular with the vast majority of Germans. When you add to that economic recovery coming out of the Great Depression, and then the confrontation with the so-called Judeo-Bolshevik menace of communist revolution, which haunted the late Weimar Republic, the basis of Hitler's growing working class support, built on a foundation of middle class and upper class voters, begins to become clear. So this is really the dilemma that historians face. How do you square the circle with terror and popular support? Tonight, I'm going to be presenting a different picture than the one you may be familiar with. Now, I want to be clear up front. This is in no way to forgive or minimize the suffering of those who were persecuted at the hands of the Nazis. But if you want never again to be more than just words, you cannot approach this subject with the post-1945 mindset. The basis of the UN Charter, universal human rights, all these ideas that essentially citizens are intended to be equal before the law, at least in principle. The way we set up these international institutions was in part a response to the Nazis. Now, the Nazis had a vision of a people's community, which divided Europe into Germans and non-Germans, and then within the country into racial comrades who were supporters and enemies of the people who had to be destroyed lest they bring the entire country down. Where you stood in relation to this vision of community determined how you were treated in Nazi Germany. Now, my book deals with how the overarching system of selective enforcement grounded in this idea evolved over time, and it deals with it in much greater detail than I have time to get into here. So it looks at who the Gestapo cooperated with, how the system changed after Stalingrad, who held enforcement authority at different times, even how Gestapo officers would talk about what they did after the war. And it does that by looking at the actual case files and experiences of people who went through the system. The thing is, I have 300 pages to get into the nitty-gritty there, and tonight I only have 40 minutes of your time. So what I'm going to do is focus on the core image that many of you will be familiar with from the Nuremberg trials. So the image of the Gestapo that I'm talking about here is the one that has dominated popular memory since 1945. Networks of spies, dreaded knock at the door in the middle of the night, being vanished to the camps, indefinite detention, starvation, and eventual death. So all of this reflects the experience of targeted minorities. And that's understandable because the first historians of the Gestapo, as well as the witnesses who appeared for the prosecution in Nuremberg, lived through the worst that the system had to offer. Tonight, what I'm going to try to do is to shine a light on what policing looked like when it involved average Germans who didn't belong to targeted groups like Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, underground communist resistance, slave labor, or Sinti and Roma. To quote the most recent overview of Gestapo research, the majority remained largely untouched and had a wholly different experience from those few declared enemies of the regime. What I want to answer for you is, what was that experience? So this project started when I was looking at the policing of Germans who listened to foreign radio stations during the war. So the files that I was drawing on were mostly from Western Germany or along the Western border where they were tuning into the BBC. So I guess at least they had good taste. But as I was going through these files, what I started to notice was that a large majority of these cases were being dismissed. And this was significant because listening to foreign radio was supposed to be a capital offense. So I thought, fine, maybe listening to radio is a different situation because there's no ideological content. It's just information. So you have to deter people, but perhaps because there isn't this kind of, it's just information, there isn't the same type of severity toward it. What happens to people who openly criticize the regime? Well, contrary to what we might expect, I found that the Gestapo policed different groups with completely different methods, depending on where they stood in relation to the Nazi vision of community. The kind of terror that we see in the movies affected 8.4% of Germans, and these were the ones who were excluded from this vision of community as enemies of the people. The Gestapo policed the other 91.6% of society from the social majority very differently. In fact, political police actually dismissed a fifth of cases where they could prove that there had been an actionable offense. So what was happening? What I found was that the Gestapo was punishing critics that they thought were intentionally attempting to turn people against the ideology of Nazism. And they were issuing warnings to so-called good racial comrades who had what they called a moment of weakness and told them to go home and, be good Germans from thenceforth. The big idea here is that terror and popularity do not merely coexist in a popular dictatorship. They are mutually reinforcing dynamics. Basically, we have to repress them, in this case, the scary communists, to protect you, right? But by linking the persecution of these groups, which are excluded from the vision of community, to the realization of political promises to the social majority, injustice can be presented as necessary to not only protecting, but improving the lives of average Germans. So if the Nazis had terrorized everyone when they ran up against opposition, this would have boiled over into resistance. Instead, the Gestapo selectively enforced the law, and by targeting groups that the rest of society viewed as a threat and warning critics who were otherwise upstanding racial comrades, they not only prevented backlash, they even built popularity in some cases. So the self-reinforcing divide that this created means that excluded minorities and members of the social majority experienced Nazism in fundamentally different ways. So before we jump into the deep end, let me give you some more background on the area that I was looking at when I was coming to these conclusions and the sources that I was using. So where exactly are we talking about? And more importantly, why does it matter to the Gestapo? This is a map of every Gestapo jurisdiction in Germany. And for your viewing pleasure, I have highlighted each of the districts that come with attached case files. So to orient you quickly here, off the top of the map in the north, that's going to be the Baltic Sea. Then to the east, you're seeing the general government, which was the rump state of what remained of Poland after annexation in 1939. To the south, that's Austria hanging off the bottom. And to the west, you have more or less the present day western boundaries of Germany. So the area within that I'm looking at, is the one with the black crosshatch. So that's Government District Dusseldorf, right on the border with Belgium and the Netherlands. So a government district is something like a county. The question is, what makes this one unique? Well, the Rhine River cuts through the district, separating the floodplains in the west from the foothills of the Bergische Land to the southeast. The Rhine, as you can see, is one of the most heavily trafficked waterways in the world. These barges that you see on it, the so-called Rheinschiff, continue to circulate the economic lifeblood of the country around the broader Rhine-Ruhr industrial region to this day. To give you a sense of just how important the area was to the national economy during the period we're talking about, 2/3 of goods traffic passed through through this region. So that includes anything that was imported and anything that was produced at in the considerable industrial center that existed here. 2/3 of it is ending up on either a railway car or a barge on its way deeper into Germany. This infrastructure allowed goods to be circulated around the industrial centers that clustered on the banks of the Rhine. So this map should give you a better sense of the scale of urbanization I'm talking about here. It puts the greater Toronto vortex to shame, really. So it's a recent land use map from North Rhine-Westphalia. The Rhine is the thick blue line running on sort of the left side there, north to south. And then the Ruhr is the second blue line on the bottom that kicks out on the east-west axis. All the red sections tucked into that elbow are the urbanized areas. And then if you look closely, you can see there's sort of a crisscrossing lattice work of lines there. That's the broader canal system that networks the entire area together. So in 1933, this area was home to roughly 5% of the entire German population. How much industry are we talking about? Well, nearly 3/4 of domestic energy production was pulled out of coal mines in the area, feeding 2/3 of domestic steel production at the sprawling integrated mills of the kind that you're seeing at the top left and the bottom right of the screen. And I hasten to note, this is by no means a complete list of all the major centers in the area. As you might guess, where there is steel, there are guns, and major production facilities dotted the region. So companies like Krupp, Rheinmetall Borsig, Bayer, Henkel, and others all had huge facilities feeding the war machine in the area. So in short, what we're looking at was one of the most important parts of the country, economically speaking, and that is significant because it is also one of the areas where the Nazis faced significant resistance. So the Nazis took the largest portion of the vote in the last election that was held in March 1933. But that number that you're seeing there, 37%, is 9 points lower than the average that they polled across the country. The Communist Party and the Catholic Center Party are meanwhile far above their national averages here. You have to remember that the Nazis came to power on the heels of the Great Depression, and with so many workers in the Rhineland, there was a sympathetic hearing for the Communist Party, far more so than the Social Democrats. The Democratic Catholic Center Party, meanwhile, held nearly 1/4 of the electorate, encompassing the remainder of sort of Catholic identifying working classes and a large portion of the middle class. So that's a big issue for the Gestapo because both of these parties positioned themselves as fierce opponents of the Nazis prior to 1933. The images here are election posters that you would have seen in public or on transit as you were heading to work at that time in this election. So the one on the left is from the Communist Party. And you can see you've got the hammer coming down on the left there. There's the capitalist with his top hat and his little Hitler mustache. And then you have this rather disconcerted looking Nazi in the middle sporting a Kaiser Wilhelm. And then on the right-hand side, you have Friedrich Ebert, one of the founders of the Republic with his little Reich Eagle pin there. So on the right-hand side, this is an election poster from the Catholic Center Party. The Center Party positioned themselves as a Christian democratic alternative that would defend the democratic system of government against political radicalism on both ends of the spectrum. So this is illustrated very clearly here when the poster says, "Hands off Prussia, vote center." And as you can see, you have your big paternalistic Center Party man. He's farmer, maybe worker, we're not sure. But he's standing over the Parliament building labeled German Reich, and quite literally holding off the communist on the left and the Nazi on the right. If you look closely here, the communist has a match out to light the Reichstag on fire, while the Nazi on the right has his hammer about to take it to the foundations of government. And so as you can imagine, this type of politics did not win these guys any favors once the Nazis came to power. Let me show you how they saw the situation. So here we have a caricature of what the Nazis called political Catholicism. And you have a cardinal on a steamroller which is, you know, his little cathedral there. And on the back roller of it, you can see the symbol for for a section of the law. So if you look at the criminal code in German, the different sections will be listed with this double S symbol, right? So this is the idea that the rule of law and the Constitution was standing in the way. And if the Nazis could just, you know, get to grips with these enemies of the people without all of these pesky checks on power standing in the way, they could finally solve the problem. The front roller says poverty, pacifism, and intolerance. This is the idea that forswearing worldly pleasures makes people susceptible to communism, and that pacifism then leaves them incapable of fighting back against it. Now, our cardinal here is shouting, "We are the bulwark against Bolshevism." But as you can see, he's flattening these spikes in the bottom right of the picture, this sort of like sea of bayonets that are labeled defenses of the people. And of course, traipsing along behind him in his wake is this merry band of Bolsheviks. So to recap, we have an economically vital area of the country where roughly half of the population voted for implacable opponents of the Nazis that were identified as enemies of the German people. Workers who largely voted communist, and middle class or Catholic voters who largely voted for the Center Party rather than the Nazis or more sympathetic nationalist alternatives. So what's a secret police to do? How does a dictatorship police criticism in a place like the Rhineland, where they have to keep order so that the economy functions smoothly, but they have limited support compared to other parts of the country? Well, to answer this question, I got to go to the State Archive of North Rhine-Westphalia, which, as you can see, is actually a converted grain elevator, which is really cool. But anyway, as you may know, whenever the police sneeze, there is paperwork. And in the fine tradition of German Gründlichkeit, the Gestapo is no exception to this rule. The State Archive shown here is home to one of 3 surviving collections that involve Germans. The one from Sichnau in Poland was one of the annexed territories, so it's primarily Poles. This is about Germans policing Germans. And it's also the only collection that comes from a regional headquarters encompassing multiple subordinate stations. So, as I said before, it's on the western border. It was captured before it could be destroyed, and is estimated at 72,000 files, about 70% complete in its entirety. So the files themselves are also very interesting. When you go into the archive, you get into this massive card index that has since been digitized, but it gives you a point form description of each file that you're looking at, and then a short description of the case. So you then take the call number off it, you go talk to one of your friendly neighborhood archivists, like Christian Gropp, who will then pull out the files that you select. And when it shows up, it will look like this. I should point out here, this is kind of an archival pilgrimage. That's Georg Elser's file. This is the guy who was responsible for the beer hall Keller assassination attempt in 1939. So the file here says, files of the Secret State Police Station Dusseldorf, followed by the suspect's name, date of birth, residence, and the date that the file was opened. So these are truly remarkable documents because they contain a step-by-step process of everything about the investigation that you can imagine. The first thing you're going to find, okay, I should point out first, prior to 1933, the files were really spotty. By 1935, the Gestapo basically establishes a stranglehold over the flow of information in the system, and more standardized forms appear. So what I'm saying here really applies from 1935 to 1944. But the first thing you're going to find once you enter this more standardized area is this thing on the left. It's a personnel questionnaire. And what it does is it paints a picture of the suspect for you. You get their name, date of birth, next of kin, their job, how much money they made, their previous political associations, so any newspapers that they subscribe to, also considered important, confessional associations, military record, medals and awards, and of course, prior criminal record and prior political record. Now, this was the information that I took and I used to compile the sort of socio-political profiles of each of the cases that I was looking at, and then correlate that data with what the outcomes were. And that's where the patterns really started to emerge. But I digress. You get 4 pages of this personal information. Then at the end, you see the picture on the right. That's sort of the description of the case that's been written up by the case officer. So if it's an important case like this one, this is Georg Elser's file again, there'll be a mugshot, and then you have this sort of short point form description of what happened, what steps were taken, and what the outcome was. So I use this information to build up a picture of how the Gestapo viewed any individual offense. So the first page after the personnel file is usually the report that started the investigation. Now, we usually think of the Gestapo as spying on everyone. Interestingly, not the case. So there's been a lot of research about this, and anywhere between 50 to 70% of reports the Gestapo received came from a denunciation from the public, like this letter here. So the spying that did exist tended to focus on targeted groups that were seen as engaged in organized resistance. So most commonly communists. The Nazis actually changed the Code of Criminal Procedure and redefined the crime of treason. And they wrote in a section that said, if you stop engaging in the treasonous activity, which we are now including anything like saying Heil Moscow or just sort of organizing a clandestine meeting, right? Then if you stop doing that and you start helping the authorities, then you won't go to jail. So what the Gestapo would do is they would use that to pick up somebody and then coerce them into informing and surveilling their previous political associates. Then they would use that to map the social circle of the person around them. And if there was any actual organization occurring, they would then use that to basically just roll up any organization that emerged. So it was extremely effective, and organized resistance had been essentially destroyed by 1935. But then that leaves us with offenses that the entire population is involved in, like criticism, where spying is significantly less important. And so the statistics that I found was that it was only in 2.5% of cases. And in those cases, it was actually being used to confirm an offense that somebody else had reported. So people would actually denounce each other for the weirdest things too. I remember in one case that I was looking at, it was the neighbor who had denounced the other person because their daughter kept coming over to do the laundry, which was running up the water bill. Thank you very much, right? So they reported them to the Gestapo for listening to foreign radio broadcasts. Now, the Gestapo wasn't dumb. They knew that people were instrumentalizing them to resolve private disputes, and they didn't want this, right? The point of this policing is to bring people into line with National Socialism and educate them. It's not to crack down on them and alienate popular support, especially not over something like a petty dispute over a water bill, right? So this is actually a caricature of a denouncer with what the Gestapo would call less than ideal motives. It says, the denouncer at the wall hears their own scandal. So this shows us the regime was aware, and you see it throughout the files, of the problems that were associated with relying on denunciations to police the public. The Gestapo actually behaved with considerable restraint as a result, and they wanted at least 3 witnesses to confirm any offense. That's what they called an impeccable clarification or an impeccable conviction. If they were only going to proceed with 2, it had to be 2 people who had absolutely no connection to one another. So even when they ran into issues here, they didn't go in abusing people to extort a confession either. Excuse me. They actually dismissed roughly 25% of cases, 1 in 4, for a lack of evidence. And this is remarkable because within half of those, the case officers were convinced that something had actually happened, but they issued a warning instead that said, like, we know that you did this, but we can't prove it. And so they don't say that they can't prove it, but we know that you did this, but you better not do it again or else. So the point, though, is that they resort to a warning rather than violence or extortion to, try and prove a crime, right? Now, if the report wasn't a denunciation, it was often typed up in an official document like this. So these would be reports that had come up through some institution of the party or other policing authorities. In this case, it's an important one, as a big red secret in the top right-hand corner that's been written in the red grease pencil that only the station leader is allowed to use. So a lot of official reports like this came from Nazi functionaries. The party was actually far more important than formal surveillance efforts by policing authorities. and they actually made just under 20% of all reports. That's because the party had a prominent presence in daily life. Their activists went around neighborhoods door to door and had representatives in factories who did things like register people for social assistance programs, organize welfare, and essentially collect for official charity drives. They also, after 1937, when there's a big hiring drive and the party apparatus expands, begin to keep notes on individual citizens. Things like how much you donated to the charity drive, whether you put the flag out on national holidays, or if you use what they called the German greeting of Heil Hitler. Now, if you get fed up with the badgering by one of these sort of raft of representatives of petty officialdom, right, and you tell them where they can go, that might then make its way back to the Gestapo. And the case officers will then be using the notes of the party officials, the notes that the party officials kept, to then decide how they're going to proceed with the case. The third thing you might find is a big red arrest order like this, stating that the suspect had been taken into protective custody. And this one is bad news. So protective custody was the official euphemism meaning indefinite detention in a concentration camp. Now, we need to be careful here to differentiate between concentration camps within Germany, where people would die due to abuse or neglect on a more or less individual basis, from the death camps in Eastern Europe, where the Gestapo deliberately and systematically murdered Jews. In most cases involving critics inside Germany, the Gestapo would use protective custody orders to hold someone in a police jail after they made some type of revolutionary comment. Something like, so the quotes that I would find are things like, when the communists win, they'll cut the throats of all Nazis, or somebody should kill that criminal Hitler. So the Gestapo would arrest this person because of an apparent threat to public safety, and then they would go on to conduct a full investigation. So remember at the beginning when I was saying how the Gestapo would use different approaches with different groups, right? This is a prime example. If the Gestapo found links to organized resistance, like if the suspect was a communist especially, right, then they would send that offender to a concentration camp even after they had served an official prison sentence. On the other hand, in most cases of criticism, where the Gestapo thought the offenders were acting as individuals rather than part of sort of like an orchestrated resistance, they would maybe hold the suspect in jail to make a show about how they might be sent to a concentration camp if they didn't behave. But then they would send the suspect to trial and consider the matter settled, even if the whole case got thrown out. Either way, though, and this is the really important point here, the Gestapo was reserving protective custody orders for violent or revolutionary statements rather than more general criticism. So after the initial reports, you start to get into the meat of the actual witness statements and interrogations in these files. The Gestapo would investigate an accusation by questioning neighbors, co-workers, acquaintances, party officials, and employers. So basically anyone within the social circle. And this was because more than just whether or not an offense had occurred, the Gestapo were interested in this guilty motive of whether or not there was subversive intent to undermine the faith of others in Nazism. So once they had compiled the evidence from their interviews in the social circle of the suspect, and they had a better picture of the character of the person that they were dealing with, the Gestapo would interrogate the suspect. Now, in these cases, what's interesting is that you would actually get a summons. It's like a little card that says, it's an appointment card. So like 11:45 on Friday, we would like you to report to room whatever at this address to have a conversation about it. And so you get this, and you can even write back and say, well, actually, Friday doesn't work for me. Can I come on Tuesday? I've got an appointment already, right? So you shouldn't do that, but it conflicts with what we expect from the Gestapo. Most witnesses are actually summoned to discuss the accusations against them. They aren't arrested. This is because the Gestapo placed a lot of weight on how a suspect would react to an accusation. So instead of charging in guns blazing, a lot of the interrogation protocols read like conversational exchanges. The Gestapo had two common techniques here, And you can actually see them being in, when you dig into the training material that's given to new officers. The first approach was to present all of the evidence that was available to the suspect and then just listen to the explanation. So if they didn't address part of what had been laid out, then the officer would begin to prod them on specific points. You know, you didn't connect this, you didn't address, this person said you said that, what about this, right? The second approach was a more open-ended general question. A kind of, where were you on the night of, only it's, do you remember, what about your conversation in the break room with, right? In these cases, the interrogator would hold back what they knew and then let the suspect explain as much or as little evidence as they wanted to. So it's sort of throwing somebody a rope and giving them enough lead to either pull themselves out of trouble or hang themselves. When they were done, the interrogator would then start to reveal the tidbits of evidence that hadn't been addressed and prompt the suspect to reveal more if they had not already confessed to the wrongdoing. So these interrogations are a little slippery because the Gestapo recorded everything as a signed statement rather than a direct transcription of questions and answers. The thing is, you can still tell a lot about the political police and how they were behaving from the tone of the statements and the reports that they file with them after the fact. The case notes here have some really rather amusing moments in them, and they drive home and underline this point that most interrogations were occurring in an atmosphere of professional courtesy. So in one, the suspect's statement was largely unremarkable, but about halfway through, you can see that the interrogator circled back to a question she'd already answered, and she appears to become quite irate about this. The case officer actually went on to write in the notes that, quote, the suspect made a good impression at her interrogation, but can become vicious if her honor is slighted. In another example like that, that I found that had a really surprisingly casual tone, right? The interrogator recorded that the suspect blithely glosses over and dismisses serious situations as comedic. He is, nevertheless, a basically honorable and open character. These kinds of observations and reactions are unthinkable when someone was facing the imminent threat of violence. And that's because in most cases, they weren't. The Gestapo were testing, trying to understand the motivation of the person that they were interrogating and guarding against abuse by a malicious denunciation, right? So not all interrogations went so smoothly for the suspect. The tone was very different if the Gestapo had enough evidence to press charges already, but the suspect flatly refused any wrongdoing, right? In these cases, the statements read more like a series of confrontations and accusations. The whole tenor of the language changes. Things like, upon questioning, I allege, or supposedly I said, reveal formal skepticism of the officer about what the suspect is saying. The interrogator may have yelled or slapped in these cases. These are far more likely to be cases where there's some type of brutality or coercion involved. I refer to them collectively as hostile interrogations as opposed to conversational interrogations. But what's remarkable about them is at the end of the case, instead of extorting a confession with this coercion, the Gestapo would still stage what they called a face-to-face confrontation, a Gegenüberstellung, where they would bring in the witness and they would bring in the suspect and they would have them sit down with each other in the same room, and then they would read their statements to each other and then just watch as they addressed the inconsistencies and argued about what had actually happened. And then they would write a report on that. And that was all about testing the actual information, being sure that if they were going to take it to trial, the evidence would hold up and that it would hold up in court. So again, the emphasis is on a process that legitimizes the punishment that's being handed out. Now, in the 200 cases I examined, I only found 2 examples of so-called enhanced interrogations. So this is when the Gestapo was torturing somebody. These cases, in line with official policy, targeted members of targeted minorities that the Gestapo had already spied on. So they knew that an offense had occurred, but the question was, and the reason that they were torturing them, is that they were trying to find out if there was a link to a broader group of people that was involved in the activity somehow. The picture that I have up here right now shows some of the telltale signs that you see in these cases of torture. The first thing is at the top line there, it says, aus der Schutzhaft vorgeführt erklärt. And that translates as remanded from protective custody. So we know that the Gestapo was holding this person in a police jail where they were conducting the interrogation. The full translation of the first sentences here is revealing, right? So it says, remanded from protective custody, Konrad Franke, admonished to tell the truth, states the following: I understand that further lying has no point. I am ready to tell the full truth. So the case notes in files like these make it even clearer with references to repeated, energetic questioning, prying confessions, and even screaming interrogations. In other examples, the interrogation will actually be interrupted physically on the page for about 3 or 4 line breaks, and then it will resume after that blank space, again with that same line. I understand that further lying has no point. This is because official policy was you weren't allowed to refer to enhanced interrogations in the files. These were not something that only the Gestapo used. They went out to state prosecutors and other outside authorities. So this shorthand developed so that people who were working the file knew what was happening in it, but could communicate to each other between the lines. So bottom line here, though, is that torture did exist, but the Gestapo was using it to unravel networks of organized resistance involving members of targeted minorities in line with the officially stated policies. When we're looking at the cases of general criticism, it only occurs in 1% of cases. In most cases, the Gestapo would secure confession by cutting a deal with the suspect. The confessions from cases with these more conversational interrogation techniques read very differently. So the suspect would confess at the initial interrogation and then express regret in the same statement. As you see here, right? Like, this is boilerplate. That last part will appear again and again and again throughout the files. It's like, I think it's 18% or 12 point, anyway, I forget. I forgot to bring my numbers on that one, but I now sincerely regret my behavior and ask for a mild judgment. Now, the Gestapo would go on from this to ask the party for what was called a political evaluation of the suspect as the final step of an investigation. A political evaluation condensed all that information that I was telling you about earlier into the details of your personal life that the party found salient and representative of whether or not you were a good member of the people's community. So the Gestapo would receive this evaluation, and then with the evidence of the people who knew you from your social circle, their own investigation about the details of the crime and their own impressions about the reasons for your motivation, and then finally this political evaluation, the Gestapo would decide how to proceed. In Nazi Germany, you have this kind of upside down state of affairs where the police are determining how to resolve the case and the courts are determining whether or not it is technically possible to convict based on the available evidence. So the Gestapo often attached these friendly recommendations to the state prosecutor in cases that would explicitly tell them how to proceed. This one is interesting because it concerns a case where normally the guy up front, the behavior of C, he normally would have received a warning, but he's involved in a conversation with another communist named K that they want to prosecute. So they have to send the whole thing to the state prosecutor if they want to secure a charge against the communist. So they accompany it with this recommendation. The example revolves around 2 workers who were accused of criticizing Hitler in 1941 because of the so-called Hess incident, which is an amazing story in and of itself. The deputy Führer, Rudolf Hess, got onto a plane and flew to Scotland, where he was going to try to unilaterally convince the Duke of Hamilton to withdraw Germany from the Second World War, or Great Britain, excuse me. He was actually captured when he crashed into the stone wall of a Scottish sheep farmer who captured him at shotgun point. So you can't make this stuff up. Anyway, this harebrained scheme, as you might imagine, attracted much derision back in Germany. The factory workers here were having a conversation where the first one said that the incident showed, quote, what type of idiots we're governed by. And the second one commented that they could, quote, thank that criminal Hitler for a recent bombing raid on their city. The Gestapo looked at the case, and as you can see here, they found that the first offender had a good political reputation. He voted for right-wing parties in the 20s. He's described as a good worker by his employers. And so the Gestapo concluded that his comments about Hess's idiocy could be seen as a one-time error, right? Noting nothing that this sort of inquest couldn't correct. But the second suspect was a communist. And as you can see, the Gestapo concluded that his criticism of Hitler deserved punishment because of his political background. So the Gestapo would also dismiss cases without ever involving the justice system. The quote here comes from the case of a choir singer who discussed rumors that Nazi heads would roll after the war, which was a pretty serious statement, and it could result in execution by 1944. The Gestapo asked about her attitudes among co-workers, who all gave solid reports about her loyalty. And the case officer decided, as you can see, that because she had confessed at the interrogation, because she had a good reputation, and because she regretted her behavior, a warning sufficed to heal her once and for all. And it's those three things, the immediate confession, the regret, and the cooperation with a good reputation, that is what secures lenience, right? So to finish with, how does all of this fit into the bigger picture? These are the results of how the Gestapo resolved all of the cases involved in my sample of 200 files. The highlights to notice here are the extremely limited use of concentration camps at only 2.5%. And I want to note there too as well, the vast majority of those, I think it's 7 of 9, if I'm recalling correctly, occur in 1933 during the revolutionary period. Now, on the right-hand side, let me break this down. On the right-hand side, we're looking at Gestapo cases. Then you can see in the bottom left quadrant, you have cases that are running through the state prosecutor. And then in the top left quadrant, those are cases that actually make it to the courts through the state prosecutor, right? What we're seeing though is that the political police were warning 9.1% of suspects that they suspected were guilty, but did not have sufficient evidence to press a charge. The most important two categories, though, are the gray one, the prosecutor, and the light blue one involving the Gestapo there. You can see the Gestapo is dismissing a remarkable 17.2% of cases of people that they can prove have committed an actionable offense. So these were cases like the opera singer that I just outlined before. The other really remarkable category is the 16.7% of cases dismissed by the state prosecutor. So oftentimes based on a recommendation like the one that I showed before. When you look at this larger picture here, only 10% of cases are making it all the way to have their day in court. And as a result, you see an incredible conviction rate of 96%, right? Like 0.5% acquittal, 9.6 convictions. But if you look at the bigger picture, that's only 10% of caseload. Taken together, authorities were dismissing 64.7% of cases, 2/3, without ever taking the incident to trial. I see that my time is running short here, so let me leave you with this thought. Selective enforcement reveals an important factor in how Hitler's popular dictatorship established and maintained support without engendering widespread resistance. So the Gestapo was ultimately the guarantor of the people's community. And this was the project that rejected the liberal cornerstones of guaranteed rights and equality before the law for new standards of belonging. This created a cultivated divide that made sure the social majority and targeted minorities were experiencing Nazism in different ways. Social control went far beyond brute force. You had coercion, but it was combined with generous social governance that proved far more effective at winning support. Criticism was even tolerable, so long as the offender fundamentally conformed. Supporters might complain, but they generally lived up to expectations. Subversives were the ones who advocated for alternatives and questioned whether Nazism truly represented the will of the people. By linking this persecution of minorities to the realization of those political promises to the majority, injustice was presented as necessary to protecting and advancing the lot of average Germans. So once again, terror and popularity did not merely coexist, they were mutually reinforcing. To understand that is to understand why people support dictatorship and genocide. It's how dictatorships suppress alternatives without not just undermining support, but even building it. And that is what's behind the resilience of their popularity that is so baffling to outsiders who aren't living through it. Most importantly, it's possible wherever we start dividing humanity into friends and enemies of the people. And that is a lesson that we forget at our peril. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time and attention, and we'll be opening to questions that you may wish to ask. We have the chat for you, and yeah, I look forward to fielding your questions. I've got all that stuff I mentioned earlier I didn't get time to talk about, or anything else you might wish to ask. So.
Ryan, can I ask one question? Who really was the creator of the Gestapo, and who was really the boss of the Gestapo?
So the Gestapo is interesting because it emerges as part of a power struggle, and it's sort of basically a bureaucratic battle that is occurring behind the scenes. But the short version of it is that the existing political police structure of the German states is rolled over to become the political police structure of the new Nazi regime. Goering is the one who renames it the Gestapo, and in the course of renaming it and fighting with the Ministry of the Interior, he plays like a shell game where he moves the Gestapo out from the Ministry of the Interior and then creates it as an independent branch of internal administration. The second thread of that story is that Heinrich Himmler, because of the Dachau model of concentration camps, ends up becoming a compromise candidate between Frick and Goering in their power struggle, because he's been busily going around the country from 1933 to 1934, basically building patronage connections and securing appointments as the sort of the local commander of political police. So Prussia, when he becomes the compromise candidate with Frick and Goering, he wins Prussia, which is the most important state in Germany. It sets a legal precedent for the whole country. But it also sort of completes his set because he's already managed to get appointments in all but one city-state in Germany. So.
Interesting, interesting. They weren't educated at all at Wee Wellsburg, were they? Where the Allgemeine and the Waffen-SS were officers were sort of disciplined and trained and put forward.
So the Gestapo create their own separate system. The early recruitment stuff is actually really interesting. It starts off with a lot of patronage appointments, and then they start weeding them out immediately because they realize that these guys aren't up to snuff, and they actually raise the education requirements to the Abitur, the university matriculation examination. It's like you gotta have a certain SAT score that lets you go to universities, which is a big deal in the 1920s and 30s. So what ends up happening there is that they start focusing on a lot of SS lawyers who are recruited, young SS men, activists during the 1920s and 30s, who are entering careers in law, and they have to go what's called a community camp. And the head of administration and law for the Gestapo, Dr. Werner Best, begins to recruit at these community camps that they have to go to. And they then build their own police training school. They take over the police college at Charlottenburg and institute basically their own training program. They go through, I think it's like a 9-month practicum, a 6-month practicum, and then I think 18 months of formal training. Mm-hmm. And so they basically just recruit SS intellectuals straight out of the university system. And it ends up being like 66% of the leadership of the Gestapo has a doctorate in law or the humanities.
Oh yeah, interesting. Because there's a lot of emphasis towards education. It's quite incredible. Like the Einsatzgruppen.
Well, if you have to convince people to engage in genocide, right? You have to have certain rhetorical abilities to persuade them of the justice of your cause in some way, right?
Yeah. Very interesting. Very interesting.
Ryan, it's Eric Morse here. I'm just wondering, how far have you gone, if you've gone at all, into the compare and contrast with USSR and the NKVD at the same time? Because one of the more interesting things that I've come across in the recent revision revisionist histories of the U.S. or of World War II is that it was the Stalinist terror that allowed Moscow to be held, and that most of it was driven by the populace.
So this
As
is
you said.
not my wheelhouse. It's only secondary research that I've dealt with, right? But sorry, was there more to that question, or?
No,
Okay, just making sure I'm eager here, right? So anyway, the Sheila Fitzpatrick and Paul Hagenlow have done a lot of work, and really my only knowledge is through them. So I would suggest that you read them first. As it relates to the Moscow campaign in 1941, I can't really say, but what has come out of the research that I have read from people specializing in policing in the NKVD is that there's a lot of parity in terms of the focus on denunciations from the public and instrumentalization of denunciations from the public. The contrast that I would see, I have not worked with the sources myself, but is that there seem to be far fewer protections and far more pressure on the NKVD to find wreckers and kulaks and former persons who are sort of impeding the project. But at the same time, that research and the research on the nationalities campaigns, which are sort of like part of the war scare in the mid-30s when the NKVD starts clearing out ethnic minorities along the western border, those tend to be driven in very short, sharp 8 or 9 month campaigns, and then the terror will back off. And Paul Hagenlow has actually shown that there's a real correlation between people who are sent to the Gulag on like 5 to 10 year lags, like long periods of time, and then they come out in waves and create a new social crisis, and then that's where the Great Terror in 1936 and 37 comes from. That's the narrative that I've been exposed to, at least.
yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you, Ryan.
Oh, Ryan, I just wanted to proceed that thing with Heinrich. Heinrich was very much a center driving position from the Fuhrer. He was quite an evil man. And was he involved with the Gestapo at all, or was he sort of kept to his own and looked after, as he's called it, the final solution?
So he's in charge of the final solution because he is the chief of the Gestapo. He's not the chief of the Gestapo.
No.
He's more important than that. He's the chief of security police and SD. So Himmler's direct deputy, and then as his direct deputy and CDS, as his position is called, that means that he's in charge of both the SS intelligence service and all ununiformed police services. So the Gestapo and the Kripo, the criminal police detective.
Yeah. Wow, that's quite something.
So he's directly involved. He's part of the reason, he's the one who creates the inspectorates and the police school, and he's deeply involved in the creation of this and he works sort of hand in glove with Werner Best in administration and law department under him until they sort of have a falling out over whether or not legal training or ideological credentials should determine the criteria for promotion.
Ryan, I just wanted to ask one thing. I don't think the Gestapo was involved in the Einsatzgruppen, the 4 groups?
In Russia, involved with the shooting.
Yeah, that's right.
Actually, so they're heavily involved with that. So like Otto Ohlendorf, all of these guys, he's from Duisburg Station, and he ends up marrying, I think, one of the stenographers there, or not stenographer, but one of the typists.
Yeah.
So actually, there's deep involvement in that. So Christopher Browning focused on the role of the protection police, which are the uniform police in Germany, and how they're rotated in and out of these police battle groups that are heavily involved in the genocide in Russia. And the administration of those groups all comes from stations. So there's a rotating system that if you want to advance in your career, you do front service in the occupied territories, and the best way to accelerate your career is to go to Russia and become involved in the genocide. So each of those Einsatzgruppen is actually managed by an SS man. I think they end up in a weird administrative limbo. They're both SD and Gestapo when they're there. I don't really deal with that. I'm focused within Germany, but.
Yeah, fascinating.
One of the points you made was the Gestapo didn't like denunciations, especially neighbor denouncing neighbor. And getting back to the other side of the Iron Curtain for a minute, do you remember the Pavlik-Morozov issue in the Soviet Union?
I'm not familiar with that, actually.
Okay, well, the story in 10 words or less is that sometime in the mid-30s, a 9-year-old kid named Pavlik Morozov, who may or may not have existed,
Right.
Denounced his parents as enemies of the state and became an instant national hero for about 10 minutes until it got to Stalin, who said, oh, come on, you can't have kids doing that.
Where the whole thing will fall apart. But Stalin also reeled in, he published Dizzy with Success. He was the one who ended the only after he'd unleashed it, right? So I have some questions here from chat as well. So Ian Sargent is asking, did the Gestapo spread outside of traditional German territories? It was exclusively German. So they operated under a militarized command structure when they were outside of Germany in the occupied territories, but they were also responsible for counterintelligence in the occupied territories, yes. That would be Department 3 counterintelligence, and they cooperate through the, what are called the BDS, the Commandants of Security Policing. So it's sort of a paramilitary structure that works with the military. My father, John Stackhouse, has asked what the chart on the last page here is all about. That's actually, as it's labeled, it's the Russian constitutional amendment vote from earlier this month. And so mathematicians in Berlin have found that there was systematic fraud, something to the order of 22 million votes. And it's actually plotting the different voting districts within Germany, or not within Germany, across Russia. And when you look at those clouds in the center, those are sort of a natural distribution. And then when you look at the areas within the ovals, you can see that the results have been rigged to line up along even numbers to the point that you see a checkerboard pattern begin to appear in the data.
I'm interested, say after 1941, how did the situation or the fact of just being Jewish figure in?
So what's interesting is when you do a random sample, there are actually very few people who were either Jewish or were defined by the Nuremberg laws as being Jewish included in the case files. So most of them you will find within completely different section of the collection underneath Jewish policy or closely related immigration files that are related to kind of like they document the appropriation of property and transportation in the Holocaust. So what it appears to be is that most Jewish people didn't risk being involved in illicit activity. So because they knew, I suppose, that they would not be given any leeway if they were found to be criticizing the regime. So you tend to find them in the Gestapo case files in other categories that are related to the kind of host of regulations that gradually excluded them from public life. That said, after 1941, I found critics of Jewish policy being dealt with quite harshly, but I didn't, the only people who were Jewish that I found, one case, and one guy who was not practicing but defined as Jewish, they were for criticism in the 30s, and they just went to court and received a punishment, but it was long before you have the establishment of the death camps. So finally, okay, so last question here from Jeff Cressman. Did average Germans give information on Jewish people and other undesirables so that they didn't get into trouble? And the answer here is no. Most of the people who are providing, there's a lot of great studies about denouncer motivations that are mixed. Some are instrumental, some are personal, some are careerist, but there's no punishment for not reporting somebody. If you're a member of the party, it technically falls under your duties, so you might lose your post. but there's no law that coerces you to report people for these kind of hosts of regulations. Well, anyway, I think that does it for questions. I don't know, Pat, if you have any closing remarks or draw this to a close, but I wanted to say thank you very much for having me here, and thank you as well for the great questions.
All I can say is many, many thanks for an enlightening, interesting, and informative presentation on a topic really that's not been explored to any great extent. And at this time, I usually present you with a thank you gift from RCMI, that being virtually impossible. Please keep a watchful eye for Canada Post, who will deliver it to your doorstep in our nation's capital, Ottawa. Thank you very, very, very much. It was most interesting and most informative. Thank you. With that, I do have one announcement. The next virtual military history night is scheduled for August the 19th with RCMI's own resident expert on all things Roman, Eric Morse, and his topic, The People Are Revolting, the Praetorians versus the Protesters, AD 238. And thank you all for your participation, and I look forward to seeing you again. Thank you very much. I now declare this meeting ended. Thank you.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.